John D. Rockefeller was ruthless and probably the most feared businessman of all time. So how did this man go from God-fearing man to the first billionaire in history and possibly the richest dynasty of all time? When I read the biography Titan by Ron Chernow, I was amazed by the sheer number of business tactics within this book. Reading biographies of high-level business people is one of the most effective ways at learning high-level business. In 1855, at only 16, John D. Rockefeller started working as a clerk at a shipping place that dealt with commodities like grain and coal in Cleveland, Ohio. 4 years later, the first U.S. oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania. Oil is also a commodity. Commodity meaning each unit of good is relatively the same thing. A barrel of oil is a barrel of oil, whether you get it from one company or another. Oil was a new emerging technology. At the time, heating oil was not used to heat your home because fireplaces and stoves did that. There was no combustion engine yet, and lamps to light your home so you could work into the night used whale oil from whale blubber. So the first uses of oil was to replace the scarce whale oil lamps. Being able to light your home into the night allowed people to work longer hours, which helped spur the advancement in technology and industrialization. In 1863, Rockefeller and a couple of partners would form Standard Oil, which is arguably the most influential company in history. Oil got the name Black Gold because if you were lucky enough to strike oil, you could become incredibly rich. This attracted many men into the oil business, but they more commonly went into the oil drilling side. These men were called wildcatters, and the workers that worked the rigs were called roughnecks because they would carry large metal piping on their shoulders, which would roughen up their necks. Oil is divided into two parts, upstream and downstream. Upstream has more to do with oil exploration or drilling, and downstream has more to do with after they do find oil, they refine it and bring it to the end user. Rockefeller is famous for saying, oil drilling is like gambling. You either get rich or you go bust. But oil refining, that's for the businessmen. This is because drilling, even today, is extremely expensive, and they often spend millions of dollars and don't even hit oil. So many men that went into this endeavor would go bankrupt. But if they did hit oil, they often just would have to sell it to a refinery. These refineries would refine it to a usable end product and sell it to the end user. This was the most powerful aspect of Standard Oil. They only focused on refining because it was way less risky. Within only 2 years of starting the company, Standard Oil grew to dominate all of Cleveland. And within only 12 years, they would hold a monopoly on all oil across the United States. Monopolies are bad, but mainly for the end user. Why? Because when they hold a monopoly, they can charge whatever price they want because people have no other options or anywhere else to go. But back in the day, the government's stance was that they liked monopolies. They would rather let a big business dominate an industry because they would have an organized production method making a higher quality product, as opposed to having a million mom and pop shops that sold inferior products. This would all change later when Teddy Roosevelt would push the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was made to oppose monopolies and protect average citizens. But it was arguably created specifically for Standard Oil because they were so ruthless in tactics and so incredibly good at what they did. The government would eventually go after Standard Oil and would end up breaking up the company in a landmark case in 1911. In a capitalist country, you can't just break up a company and push the owner out. Rockefeller was able to retain stock ownership in most of these companies. Over the years, these companies would expand and merge into bigger companies, and by the 1930s, they were known as the Seven Sisters. These seven sisters ended up once again dominating the entire industry. And although Rockefeller didn't own all of them, he held stock in most of them. So in the end, the breakup actually benefited Rockefeller because he became way richer than ever before and became the first billionaire. But wait a minute, let's back up. How did Rockefeller dominate everything so fast? Why did the government change their stance on monopolies and break up his company? Firstly, Rockefeller was feared and a ruthless businessman, and he came up with some ingenious ways to dominate and even trounce the dominating industry at that time, which was the railroads. The railroad titans, like the current all-time richest man in the world, Commodore Vanderbilt for the time, was a complete thorn in the side of all oil men because they controlled transportation of all things, including oil. But before we understand this ruthless, shrewd businessman, we have to understand his origins and how he came to be. In the old days, religion dominated everything, and Rockefeller was a God-fearing businessman. He went to church often, and it's often said that he gave away 10% of his wealth to the church throughout his career, which is staggering. But whether or not that's true or just a PR campaign to repair his later broken image is unknown. The story goes, because of his dedication to God, he felt that he was ordained by God to shepherd the wealth of people, better the money in his hands for the progress and the change that he could create with it. It's kind of hard to beat a guy that feels like he's doing God's work. Okay, but what were the tactics that Rockefeller used? Arguably, the most powerful tactic is this. Oil and gas is cyclical, meaning it goes through boom and bust cycles just like the stock market. You have bull markets where the price is uptrending and holding high, and you have bust cycles like a bear market where prices fall super low. In a booming oil market, oil companies are getting rich from the price of oil being so high. So they often headhunt and steal talent and massively expand their business to take advantage. But the opposite bust cycle that eventually comes is when oil prices fall and oil companies might be losing money. So they start firing all non-essential personnel. Many companies often go bankrupt because of this overexpansion during these bull cycles. Knowing this, Rockefeller would often just wait till a down year, knowing that most companies would be hurting for money or on the brink of bankruptcy. This obviously affected Rockefeller too, but many times in his career he took out massive loans from banks to get him through these hard times. But he was known to always do the right thing and always pay back his loans. So these banking relationships would end up being a massive advantage to him and would help him take over the industry. Rockefeller didn't have to wait till a bust cycle. He could create his own. He was willing to lose money in the short term to dominate later. So he would drop his oil prices so low that he would be losing money on it. And with these abnormally low prices, all of the buyers and consumers would flock to him, leaving his competitors high and dry. Since oil is a commodity, they couldn't differentiate their product, so they were forced into these price wars. And Rockefeller wanted this. Once his competitors were also losing money, it was just a matter of who had more money to outlast the other. Rockefeller having a lot of money, but he also had these extensive banking relationships, and he used these banking loans to help him through these self-induced hard times. Once his competitors were broken, he would swoop in and buy them out at a steep discount. Once Rockefeller owned all the refineries in the area, aka monopoly, he had no competition, and he would reverse his strategy and skyrocket prices, reaping massive profits. This is how he took over Cleveland in just 2 years, and he replicated this strategy throughout his career to dominate the United States in only 12 years. Another common tactic that he used, which may have been more prevalent as the anti-monopolistic sentiment grew, he would buy out a competitor in the area. Instead of replacing this competitor's brand signage and putting up his Standard Oil sign, he would leave the old company name up. This gave the people a false sense of competition and choice, when really he owned all the different brands of companies in the area. Later, he adopted what I call the co-op tactic. If he bought out a refinery, often for pennies on the dollar, it was still incredibly expensive to do that on a massive scale. So instead of paying them in cash, he often offered company stock in his company. By giving them that stock in his company, he didn't have to come up with the cash, so he could expand much faster. But this also created a giant co-op of like-minded like-minded businessmen that all had extensive oil and gas experience to help him do his bidding. He used them as spies to get information, to help topple competitors, or to learn specific local approaches to beat competitors in a certain area. The powerful railroad tycoons like Commodore Vanderbilt posed a massive obstacle for Rockefeller. This would include Andrew Carnegie, who later created Carnegie Steel. But before Carnegie got rich, taking America from the Iron Age into the Steel Age, he was a railroad man. And Rockefeller trounced his mentor, putting him out of business, something that would leave Carnegie with a vendetta. Railroads were in control of transportation and could charge any price that they wanted to these oil men because often there weren't any other choices to transport their oil. Railroads were subject to the same consumer protection and anti-monopolistic laws of all businesses. In the beginning, these railroads would compete with each other to transport oil, but they had their own price wars with each other, and that race to the bottom was not good for their industry. Some of the most powerful railroad men would form secret cartels so they could form a unified front to fix prices. Railroads were known for squeezing oil men and charging them incredibly high prices. In the oil business, you have to go where the oil is, and it's often in remote locations. But once you do strike oil, you have to transport it to refineries via the railroad. So the railroads held incredible power, and once they started cartel price fixing, they could charge whatever they wanted. Initially, Rockefeller eased this burden with back alley handshake deals with his own secret railroad group that was not subject to price fixing. In these secret railroad groups, the railroads would give a low freight cost. In exchange, Rockefeller would guarantee a minimum but very large volume per load. So Rockefeller got his cheap prices, and the railroads made their money through volume. But sometimes Rockefeller had to pay these giant minimum volumes even when he wasn't filling that capacity, which resulted in Rockefeller hating the railroads for the power that they wielded over him. So he would pioneer a new technology to completely cut them out. He is attributed with creating the modern day pipeline, or at least massively expanding the infrastructure of them. A pipeline was crazy expensive to build, but once it was built, he didn't need the railroads anymore, and he could end up saving massive amounts of money by having a pipeline. He later copied the business model of the railroads. A railroad company would own a particular railroad route, so you were forced to pay them or create your own railroad. Instead, he owned the pipeline, so he guaranteed himself cheaper oil transportation costs, but it also gave him more control and power over the oil industry because he could tax certain drilling companies and tax competing refineries alike because they controlled the routes. So you either pay him or you pay the super high railroad freight cost. Rockefeller was dominating, but when a man named Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, it threatened Rockefeller's biggest revenue, the kerosene lamp to light homes at night. Initially, light bulbs were only for the rich, but the technology grew and became cheaper and more prevalent to commoners' households. But Rockefeller would hit a stroke of luck due to a completely different industry, the invention of the automobile, which ran on oil derivatives like gasoline and diesel. In particular, it was a man named Henry Ford, the founder of auto giant Ford. Why? Because he pioneered the assembly line and automobile production exploded, allowing for much cheaper cars that were available to the masses. This, of course, would explode oil demand for Rockefeller. Rockefeller believed in technology and knew that as technology and methods got better, new opportunities would open up. This was well demonstrated when he discovered an idea. Sometimes oil pulled out of the ground is called sour oil because of its high sulfur content. This was worthless as the refineries couldn't use it, but Rockefeller saw the opportunity. Eventually, his chemists would figure out a way to clean up sour oil, and then it would be worth a lot more. So he bought up vast tracts of sour oil fields for next to nothing. And a couple of years later, his chemists did crack that code, and he reaped massive profits. Many of the products today use petroleum derivatives. Plastic industry, for example, is the gold standard of all packaging any type of byproduct and is used in almost everything, as well as many chemicals, which often have oil byproducts. It's really hard to think about any other industry that is more prevalent than oil and gas. The United States is forever locked into oil and gas. OPEC, which controls most of the oil in the entire world, only exchanges through the US dollar, which helps support the US currency. The American military, as well as all militaries, are highly reliant on oil, and so they're willing to go to war for it. American oil companies pioneered international relationships and diplomacy before the American government ever really did, by embedding themselves into these third world countries to gain access to the oil and mineral riches that they had. This often started by handing bags of cash under the table to whoever the country's leaders were, a practice that resulted in the country's leaders becoming incredibly rich and the people with no real benefit. In the stock market, oil companies are considered old and boring companies, and they don't have the sexy multiples that tech companies have. But in terms of revenue generated, they are still among some of the biggest companies in the world. And big oil is still embedded in American politics, certainly slowing down progress into things like alternative energies. Today, a popular wealth topic is whole life insurance. Whole life insurance is a powerful tool used at preserving and passing down wealth to the next generation, but less so as just a strict wealth building tool. Rockefeller may have done it best. Often in a wealthy family, one man made all the money, and then the family just spends it. Your son didn't earn it cutting his teeth in the field. He just grew up rich. And your son's son is even further remote from that. Most of the time, these super wealthy families dwindle, and within 2 generations, the wealth is gone. Rockefeller solved this with whole life insurance. His sons would inherit his wealth, but not directly. His trust would own it and use whole life insurance to pass it down. So yes, his sons would get their full cut of their inheritance, but it was in the form of a business loan, a loan that they had to pay back. Now, if they squandered it and didn't pay it back, then that's it, you're done, you don't get it anymore. But if they did pay it back, they could borrow it again and again. But again, if they didn't pay it back, the insurance company in this whole life insurance policy would pay out dividends based on that policy. So eventually these dividends would end up paying back the loan for him. This would help compartmentalize and preserve the family's wealth through the generations. Speaking of passing money down, Rockefeller was well known for his charitable contributions to his church, and later, as his reputation labeled him as a monopolistic villain, he made massive other contributions. He created the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Center in New York. His vast contributions into the medical industry helped push medical advancement much faster. He also made contributions and helped shape the modern day school system and the curriculum. Rockefeller also gave heavily into government and politics, possibly pioneering the modern day lobbyists who represent commercial interests in government. But he was a very shrewd businessman, and many of his charitable contributions helped advance his wealth and his legacy in one way or another. In some of my other videos, like the story of Bill Gates, we talk more about billionaires using nonprofits to push commercial interest and influence. The Rockefeller and the Carnegies did it way before them though, and they served as the model of the modern day philanthropist that they use today. Why give when you can give and profit? This video is just the tip of the iceberg of the business genius of John Rockefeller. Want to know more? Then check out the book Titan by Ron Chernow to learn more about the business tactics that he used, like crushing labor unions. Want to watch a movie that shows how ruthless oil men really were? Then check out Daniel Day-Lewis's There Will Be Blood. And if you like the story, then make sure you hit that like and subscribe button right now. Stay tuned for upcoming stories about the men who built America, like Andrew Carnegie of Carnegie Steel, who some consider more successful than Rockefeller, and Commodore Vanderbilt, who owned the transportation industry in shipping and railroads. And if you're broke and out of work, why don't you try oil and gas, because you can get a field job making $80,000 to $110,000 per year, starting with no experience. Trust me, I've had several. Nothing will put hair on your chest faster than swinging a sledgehammer with them country boys. Brother, let's go!